Many of you probably don't think you like poems, but it's too late. We've locked the doors. I thought I would read maybe a half a dozen poems. And then, Mako, are we going to then do a Q&A? Yeah. So let me just do maybe a half a dozen poems that are very different from each other. I thought I would begin and end with a sort of love poem and then do other things in between. This is a poem that, being raised in Hawthorne, I didn't really have much direct contact with nature. I really didn't know nature except for the beach, the ocean. And when I was when I was in college was when I first saw nature. And this is about actually the first time I saw spring. I drove up to Sonoma County, where I now live. I had no idea I would end up living there, with a girl I was in love with, and we walked through an apple orchard. The apple orchard. You won't remember it. The apple orchard we wandered through one April afternoon, climbing the hill behind the empty farm. A city boy, I'd never seen a grove burst in full flower or breathed the bittersweet perfume of blossoms mingled with the dust. A quarter mile of trees in fragrant rows arching above us, we walked the aisle, alone in spring's ephemeral cathedral. We had the luck, if you can call it that, of having been in love, but never lovers. The bright flame burning, fed by pure desire, nothing consumed, such secrets brought to light. There was a moment when I stood behind you, reached out to spin you toward me. But I stopped. What more could I have wanted from that day? Everything, of course. Perhaps that was the point, to learn that what we will not grasp is lost. Now, if you go to most museums, almost all of the early art, in one way or the other, is religious. It had a ritual function, which has now been lost. It's now, put on display as an aesthetic object, removed from whatever its spiritual purpose. This is a poem spoken by a statue in a museum. It's a santo, which, if you know Southwestern art, these are these wooden sculptures that are used in rural churches or home altars of saints, of angels, of the Virgin. And they're all done anonymously. We don't know the names of the people that did them. And this is a Mexican santo in a museum, which survived the Mexican Revolution when the church was outlawed and all the churches were vandalized and the art destroyed. And it's now in a museum. So the angel with the broken wing. I am the angel with the broken wing, the one large statue in this quiet room. The staff finds me too fierce, and so they shut faith's ardor in this air-conditioned tomb. The docents praise my elegant design above the chatter of the gallery. Perhaps I am a masterpiece of sorts, the perfect emblem of futility. Mendoza carved me for a country church. His name's forgotten now, except by me. I stood beside the gilded altar where the hopeless offered God their misery. I heard their women whispering at my feet, prayers for the lost, the dying, and the dead. Their candles stretched my shadows up the wall, and I became the hunger that they fed. I lost my left wing in the revolution. Even a saint can savor irony. When troops were sent to vandalize the chapel, They hit me once, almost apologetically. For even the godless feel something in a church, a twinge of hope, fear, who knows what it is, the trembling unaccounted by their laws, an ancient memory that they can't dismiss. There is so much I must tell God. The howling of the damned can't reach so high, but I stand here like a dead thing nailed to a perch, a crippled saint against a painted sky. If you're a poet, you write a poem, and in the act of writing it, you have the illusion. Anybody who's a poet in the audience can back me up in this. When you're writing it, it's going to be the greatest poem ever written. It's just, you can't believe how good it is. And then you go back to it like a week later, and it's not so good. But it's part of the delusion of inspiration. What they call it, the divine afflatus. Is blindness. Of a sorts too. And so what I've taken the liberty is to describe my next poem, which will be the greatest one. And this poem is called "The Next Poem." How much better it seems than when it is finally done. The unforgettable first line, the cunning way the stanzas run, the rhymes soft-spoken and suggestive are barely audible at first, an appetite not yet acknowledged, like the inkling of a thirst, while gradually the form appears, as each line is coaxed aloud, the architecture of a room, seen from the middle of a crowd. The music, that of common speech, but slanted so that each detail sounds unexpected as a sharp inserted in a simple scale. No jumble box of imagery dumped glumly on the reader's lap, or elegantly packaged junk the unsuspecting must unwrap, but words that could direct a friend precisely to an unknown place, those few unshakable details that no confusion can erase, and the real subject left unspoken, but unmistakable to those who don't expect a jungle parrot in the black and white of prose. How much better it seems now than when it is finally written. How hungrily one waits to feel the bright lure seized, the old hook bitten. My wife and I lost our first son at 4 months. Actually, this afternoon I was talking to another member of this community who, lost a son at 18 months. And anybody who has lost a child or seen a grandchild or a sibling, I don't have to describe the experience. You know what hell that is. But there's something else, and I've never seen anybody talk about it, which is if you lost the child, ever thereafter, when you see a kid that would be about the same age, you go, that's what my son would be doing. That's how big my boy would be. And so you have this kind of phantom childhood that your son or daughter goes through. And this is a poem I wrote on what would have been my son's 21st birthday. It's called, to use the legal term, majority. Now you'd be 3, I said to myself, seeing a child born the same summer as you. Now you'd be 6 or 7 or 10. I watched you grow in foreign bodies, leaping into a pool, all laughter, or frowning over a keyboard, but mostly just standing, taller each time. How splendid your most mundane actions seemed in these joyful proxies. I often held back tears. Now you are 21. Finally, it makes sense that you have moved away into your own afterlife. And I think I'll just end with, with one poem. This is something you don't see written about much in poetry. Is a happy marriage. Now, I guess it's easier to tell your spouse a thing or two, in this. And what's the metaphor for a happy marriage? And I think one of the metaphors is language. If you're really in love with someone when something that happens to you is not entirely real until you told your beloved about it. Marriage, I think, is a kind of endlessly inexhaustible conversation. And what happens after a long time is you create a private language with your spouse. You have your images, your jokes, your words. You can say something to them that nobody knows what really means, except the two of you. And it's temporary, because when you're gone, it's gone. Maybe your kids will remember a few of the things. And it reminded me of these tribes like in California or elsewhere. There's only a few native speakers left, and when those people die, the language is gone, the legends are gone, the customs are gone, and marriage is that kind of happy tribe. Even sex is a kind of conversation. And so this is a poem. It's the last poem in this book, and most recent poem. It's called Marriage of Many Years. Most of what happens beyond words. The lexicon of lip and fingertip defies translation into common speech. I recognize the musk of your dark hair. It always thrills me, though I can't describe it. My finger on your thigh does not touch skin. It touches your skin, warming to my touch. This intimate patois will vanish with us. It's only native speakers. Does it matter? Our tribal chants, our dances round the fire, performed the sorcery we most required. They bound us in a spell time could not break. Let the young vaunt their ecstasy. We keep our tribe of two in solemn secrecy. What must be lost was never lost on us. Thank you so much.
See what I mean about Dodger Stadium? Can we do this? Okay, so we have plenty of time. Q&A, which is, if you know me well, when I lead, we always run out of time. So this is an unusual moment when BREHM Center, you have actually time left for Q&A. So please come up to these microphones and ask away. Is there somebody? Okay, so we'll start.
I try to get to Robert Johnston's class, so I'm going to ask my question first. I'm a Fuller alumni, so I'm auditing his class. But I haven't been back in this auditorium for over 10 years, so it's a great way to be here. I do have a very simple question, but I'll preface it by saying I work at USC. And to make it short, I'm sort of a minister to academia now. And I wonder what observations you've made serving at USC in the capacity that you do, and what you might share. I know it's a very open-ended question, but I'm more interested in what you've seen there.
Well, it's a simple question, but it's a huge one to answer. If you come to USC and you teach, it seems to me that you have to make the decision whether what you're doing is just showing up to class and providing a kind of focused instruction, or if, in a sense, you're going to try to be a useful and helpful model in the lives of people who are trying to figure out their futures. I can't just do the first. I'm used to working business hours, which is different from academics. Sometimes academics just have 1 or 2 hours a week that they're available. I just tend to go in my office. I do work, leave the door open, and I have lots and lots of students come in. Some of it need academic advice. Some of them need life advice. There's a lot of young men and women who have giant holes in their life. There's a lot of men and women who want to do something with their life, but they don't understand the world well enough on how to do it. So I try to advise practical, philosophical, parental, or educational to do this, and you never know what's going to walk in through the door. I often have kids come in crisis. They'll be coming in for a specific reason that seems to be academic. But I think any teacher here knows that there's something else there. And sometimes they don't even want to talk about it. They can't talk about it. And you try to just, at the very least, make sure nothing bad happens to them. But you try to guide them, in a sense, to useful and good places their life might take it. So it's a huge job. You never do it well enough, but you try. Shut people up. Let me say one thing before this. This evening is, what's important about this evening is the audience. Is that we're in a room together, we're talking about things that matter, we're conversing about them, we're thinking about these things in a way that's probably unlikely to happen anywhere else. Yeah, please.
I love art and I love poetry, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the power potentially of poetry, to shape sort of public life. And I know that that's something that you've done through Shakespeare and other things. So, where can poetry kind of come out of the library or the corner of the bookshop and come out into public life and have an impact?
Well, let me just make a couple of observations. That's a very good question. Poetry is our most concise, expressive, and memorable way of using words to describe our existence, not only to one another, but to ourselves. And we are prisoners of language. We use language socially. We use language with our friends. We use language with our family, with our spouses. We use language to talk to God. And so if we lose our ability to use language, to shape language, to hear language, we lead lives of diminished human potential. Now, if you go back to societies throughout history, all societies use poetry in education. And you can say, well, part of it is that, it's a pleasurable way of, learning this, that, or the other, of learning to speak and everything else. But I think it's also because if we're educating younger people, we not only have to educate their minds, we have to educate their bodies. That's why sports and music and dance and things like this are important, but also their emotions. And poetry does all of this. And so societies that incorporate poetry in education it very naturally spills over into the public life because it gives us not only the language to express things, but the metaphors. Ships passing in the night, two roads diverged. I mean, you go on. So many of these metaphors are poetic metaphors. I think our society has, in a sense, and I just know this from, you can see this actually from studies. I can see it from my students. Every year, the vocabulary gets smaller. Every year, more and more of the metaphors that are being done are being pulled from advertising, from commercial products, from brand names. And I think that we're ceding the commonwealth, the public domain of our language, into trademarks and brand names and things like this. And we're less and less able to explain and articulate and maybe even recognize the subtleties of our existence. And so I think that it's not simply about public life, it's about education. Now, I have to say that poets have done an especially bad job of making poetry popular. I mean, so many of literary people in the United States, because their careers are in academics, they're incredibly good at talking to each other without being very good at talking to the rest of the world. And so, I think we have to reinvent the intellectuals, the artist's position in society, reintroduce the arts into every level of education. And then I think we'll see transformations happen. So, anymore? I should tell you, I have no idea if you're even out there, because I just see these bright lights, and so I guess there's somebody. Is there there's somebody there.
Hi, I'm out here.
It's like an eye exam.
I don't know if I have a question so much as maybe a thank you. I'm also a Fuller alum. I came here for a BREHM degree a few years ago as a singer, but also more specifically as a classical vocalist and a choral singer. And I've had the good fortune the past couple of years of singing a setting of one of your poems called The Prayer by Morton Lauritsen, or set by Morton Lauritsen. And that has been an experience in and of itself. But also, as a result of that, I was also, one day I finally flipped to the publisher's note at the front of the copy of the music, and it specified that it had been also written in honor of or in response to the death of your son. And I was able to give that poem to a friend of mine who was also struggling from the loss of her son from SIDS at 9 months. And so maybe if there is a question in this, I was wondering if you could speak more to the ability of poetry to comfort people in times of grief, and maybe in your experience of also writing that poem.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say I'm so glad that you know the music of Morton Lauritsen, who is simply one of the greatest American composers ever, and whose music, if you don't know O Magnum Mysterium, Lux Aeterna, his song cycles, he is comparable to the greatest choral, and vocal composers who ever lived. I went to a concert at Kennedy Center. They were performing Beethoven, Brahms, and I think Bach and Lauritsen. And I was talking to the singers afterwards. I said, well, what do you think was the best piece? And they all looked at me like, are you crazy, Lauritsen? And it's I think it's because, in a sense, for singers, he finds a way of channeling your almost creating almost a hypnotic intensity of performance. I've just brought out my selected poems, and so I had the task of saying, how do I make sense of all these poems I've written? First of all, I cut about more than half of them away, and I decided to arrange them not chronologically or whatever, but by theme. And I did, so I begin with mystery, which is a lot of poems about faith and about our existence. Place. Later I do imagination, story, song, I end with love. But the third section is remembrance. And they're poems that were largely written from the death of my son, from the death of other people I loved. And it came out of this experience, which is that, when you are deeply struck by grief, you feel isolated. It's almost like there's a glass wall between you and the rest of the world. You can't feel anything. You can't taste anything. Nothing gives you joy. And so I'm going to speak without a microphone. I know this guy hates it. Who in this room knows something you could say to somebody who's lost a child, lost a spouse, that's going to make them feel better? You can't do it. It just can't be done. But what you learn, if you go through this yourself, if you go through this with elders, you have to speak. You have to comfort them. And you may be as useless as Job's comforters, but it's easier for those people to have you next to them than to be isolated. And you can gradually bring them forward. About once a year, it happened just around Christmas time this year, I get a phone call or an email from somebody and say, my friend just lost a child from SIDS. Will you talk to her? Will you talk to him? And then I usually have a series of 3 or 4 really intense, exhausting conversations. And one of the things you're telling them is, you're not the only person that's gone through this. There is life after this. There are more children after this, and you'll get through it. And, you give them some advice. But I think it's, I'm a member of a club I didn't want to join, but it's my club. I mean, our lives lead us places, and the worst thing you can do is to deny the places that you do. And so one of the odd things about losing our son, and I think my wife would say the same thing, is it makes us more sensitive to the suffering, the pain, the loss of other people. And I can talk about it unembarrassed. Americans are embarrassed to talk about death. But guess what we all have in common in this room? We're all going to die. And so, you need to be able to talk to people about this. You need to not be embarrassed to show up. So, it's kind of pretty basic stuff. I don't think there's any eternal wisdom in what I've said, but I do think that, for me, when you have pain and you have suffering, which our faith tells us, is part of our existence, we try to make that pain redemptive, that suffering redemptive for ourselves and others. And guess what? We have a pretty good role model in that.
Thank you.
Is it maybe one more question?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Seth. I'm currently a BREHM student here as well. And I'm also a writer, so I've seen a variety of poets, and I noticed that you seem to memorize and actually recite a lot of your poems that way. So I guess I was just wondering, is that something you've always done? Is that something you feel good at?
I have to say, I haven't really memorized my poems. And I'm not making them up as I go along. I wish I could. I was trained in music. How many musicians do we have in the audience? Don't you, when you're playing, know a lot of your stuff by heart? Especially if, you're doing, small combos, you're singing. And so if you're a musician, you kind of train your auditory memory. And so when I write poems, I kind of say them to myself, and by the time I'm done with the poem, I pretty much have it memorized, and it's sort of come out of that. So it happens. But the reason I think it's important is I believe that poetry, and I can prove this through anthropology, it's the same art as song. You go back to ancient societies, all poetry was chanted or sung, and it's an oral art. And so the most effective way, is reading poems is good, but, I think you have to be kind of an intelligent and educated person a lot of times to read poetry. Most people love to hear a good poem recited well. And here's the thing: is if I see this poem on a page, it's outside of me. If I hear it, it's inside me. And what made me fall in love with poetry was my mother, who didn't have much education. She had to memorize poems in school. That was in those terrible days when they oppressed children by making them memorize great language. Isn't that awful? I mean, how did they survive that cruelty? And so she would just she would just read these it was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And that maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, and we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee. And that's what got me interested, that enchantment, that magic of poetry. And I think what it does, it's just like a song. It's like music. You ever seen people in a concert, they begin to tap their feet? Their physical body is reacting to the music. And it engages, you as a incarnate human being. I mean, we're not angels. We got these big, heavy, hairy, hungry bodies that we carry along with us. And so I like the kind of poetry that sort of captures not just the imagination, but the ear, captures the heart. I mean, Mako and I had the good fortune of working on the board with Ben Donnenberg, who created Shakespeare Festival LA. Ben's probably been here, and one of his things, remember, is a Shakespeare actor saying, iambic pentameter, da-dump, 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 da-dump. It's not iambic pentameter. This is iambic pentameter. It's the poet's heartbeat asking the audience to synchronize with it. Because if we synchronize our physical selves, we can communicate in all kinds of ways that are above and beyond the words. And I think that's the magic of poetry. That's the magic of a great speaker, of a great sermon. When Jesus spoke to the multitudes, he gave them parables and poems, because he knew, that in a sense would engage them in the naturalness and completeness of their humanity. So, did I answer your question in the least?
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me end with a little 6-line poem. It's about how most of our lives are kind of invisible to anyone but us. So much of our life is internal. It's almost secret. It's called Unsaid. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead.